The absurdity of the purposeful life. Note: the following essay first appeared on October 2009 on Thomas McEvilley's Badlands blog, an Amazon customer discussion website, under the heading, "Welcome to McEvilley's Badlands blog, home of the logic locos, aficionados of philosophical graffiti. First up, the absurdity of the purposeful life." The phrase the ancient Romans used to express the notion of doing something intentionally or on purpose is de industria, or ex industria, or simply industria. Hence, the root meaning of the English cognate industry, that is, the form which the Latin word assumed in English, refers to purposeful activity, as in the phrase, cited by the Concise Oxford Dictionary, to do something of industry, which in England in 1613 meant to do something on purpose. Although the English cognate eventually shifts the emphasis from the purposefulness of the activity to its persistence, if I reapply the root meaning to the English word, I discover the reason why the harder I work to survive, the more absurd I am. Generally speaking, to act with purpose means to plan an activity which has a specific result, such that obtaining the result or failing to obtain it marks the end of the activity. Therefore, when I say that I did something on purpose, I imply that I had a particular end in mind, in both senses of the word end. A specific outcome, as when we speak of having the means to achieve a certain end, and the cessation or end of the activity with the attainment or failure to attain the intended outcome. That purposeful activity is directed toward achieving a specific outcome is, I believe, self-evident. But that achieving or failing to achieve the outcome requires a cessation of activity for the activity to qualify as purposeful requires further explanation. Suppose the purpose I have in mind is, on the contrary, to produce an activity which never ends. So long, then, as the activity continues, I appear to keep to my purpose. But here's the paradox. I can never claim with certainty that I have achieved my purpose so long as the activity does continue. For if the activity must aim at an outcome to be purposeful, but in the case of an infinite activity, that is, of an activity which never ends, the outcome must be permanently postponed if the outcome is to be achieved, I can never determine whether the activity is purposeful or not. Indeed, this is the underlying paradox that compels fundamentalist Christians to insist that the world must end. For only if the world ends can its existence be shown to have been purposeful, and hence divinely intended. Otherwise, so long as the world persists, its purposefulness is in doubt. To sum up, then, if an activity continues without end, or, if I may add, ends but with a surprising unforeseen result, or ends with no perceptible result at all, then strictly speaking, the activity, for all the good or bad it may do, is unintentional or purposeless. As with a never-ending activity, so with any object of infinite extent, we can never determine whether it exists purposefully or not. Consider physical space. We are born into a space which apparently is without limit both in extent and duration, so that being without limit, the existence of space can never be shown to have been purposeful. That is, its infinity can never be reduced to being a means to an end. Likewise, the coming into existence and ceasing to be of all the myriad forms of nature is presumably also without end, and hence also without purpose. Therefore, it has always struck me as remarkable that intentional or purposeful behavior is the defining characteristic of humankind. For to live a life without purpose is everywhere synonymous with having lived in vain. And while my life certainly ends, to construe my death as the end and purpose for which I was born is the height of absurdity. Now, I grant that the afterlife religions like Christianity and Islam elevate death, at least for the pious believer, into eternal glory. It's as if the founders of these religions scrupulously respected the logic of purposefulness, insisting that the end of life is indeed the object to be obtained, since death alone entitles one to candidacy for eternal life. But for those of us who believe we are made of earth, by earth, for earth, to claim that death is the purpose of life makes as little sense as claiming that suffocation is the purpose of breathing. But what in general motivates people to devote their energy on a regular basis to achieving specific goals, that is, to working industriously? The answer is simple and obvious: survival. The more our lives and livelihoods are endangered, the more purposeful the expenditure of energy to defend ourselves and our possessions. To illustrate this point, and to document an example from the 2nd century BC of the kind of organized industrial activity we associate with the modern factory, consider Appian's descriptions in his Roman history, written in the 2nd century AD, of the plight of the Carthaginians after they've surrendered their weapons to the Romans following defeat in battle, but on learning that the Romans intend to transfer the population inland so that the sea is inaccessible, change their minds and resolve to defend Carthage at all costs. Quote, "The same day as the Roman announcement to transfer the population inland, the Carthaginian Senate declared war and proclaimed freedom to the slaves." Let me interject here that the Senate emancipated the slaves in order to recruit them into the Carthaginian army. Throughout the ancient world, slaves were forbidden to bear arms lest they turn them against their owners. Furthermore, official proclamation of freedom also implies that the slave owners, many of them wealthy senators and thus large slaveholders, have agreed to forego compensation for surrendering their property. This voluntary loss is indicative of the extremity of the situation. Otherwise, confiscation and liberation of slaves by the state, along with redistribution of land and cancellation of debts, constitutes socialist revolution ancient style. But more on this topic in future offerings. Back to the quote. They also sent to the Roman consuls asking a truce of 30 days in order to send an embassy to Rome. When this was refused a second time, a wonderful change in determination came over them to endure everything rather than abandon their city. Note: abandon their city sounds like nostalgia until we realize that the inhabitants of Carthage, one of the wealthiest commercial cities of the ancient world, face a life of destitution unless they defend their access to the sea. Quickly all minds were filled with courage from this transformation. All the sacred places, the temples, and every other wide and open space were turned into workshops, where men and women worked together day and night on a fixed schedule, without pause, taking their food by turns. Each day they made 100 shields, 300 swords, 1,000 missiles for catapults, 500 darts and spears, and as many catapults as they could. For strings to bend them, the women cut off their hair for want of fibers." Unquote. Here, then, is an ad hoc factory dating from 148 BC, created by the desperate need on the part of the Carthaginians to prevent the Romans from imposing a crushing poverty on them. Rather than submit to Rome, the Carthaginians renew the war and fight until the city falls and is destroyed. Once again, it would be absurd to call the destruction of Carthage the purpose of 700 years of Carthaginian civilization. On the contrary, with the destruction of the city by the Roman general Scipio, centuries of endeavor to sustain the existence of the city come to nothing. In a single day, Carthage becomes meaningless. Here's Appian's description. Scipio, beholding this city, which had flourished 700 years from its foundation, and had ruled over so many lands, islands, and seas, as rich in arms and fleets, elephants and money, as the mightiest empires, but far surpassing them in hardihood and high spirits, since when stripped of all its ships and arms, it has sustained famine and mighty war for 3 years, now come to its end in total destruction. Scipio, beholding this spectacle, is said to have shed tears, and publicly lamented the fortune of the enemy. After meditating by himself a long time, and reflecting on the inevitable fall of cities, nations, and empires, as well as individuals, upon the fate of Troy, that once proud city, upon the fate of the Assyrian, the Median, and afterwards of the great Persian Empire, and most recently of all of the splendid empire of Macedon, either voluntarily or otherwise, the words of the poet escaped his lips. The day shall come in which our sacred Troy and Priam, and the people over whom spear-bearing Priam rules, shall perish all. Being asked by Polybius in familiar conversation, for Polybius had been his tutor, what he meant by using these words, Polybius says that he did not hesitate frankly to name his own country, for whose fate he feared, when he considered the mutability of human affairs. And Polybius wrote this down just as he heard it. Unquote. If I add to the inevitable fall of cities, nations, empires, the extinction of the human species itself, which the death of each individual, let us suppose, microcosmically foreshadows, then it follows that since the species ends with no perceptible result or outcome at all, for who is there to perceive it, its day-to-day existence prolonged over thousands of millennia is ultimately without purpose. Is it any wonder, then, that since my survival requires the continuous application of purposeful behavior, and acting purposefully in turn requires acting with resolute singleness of mind, but that the more acutely aware I am of the incongruity of acting with purpose in a universe that is without end, and as a member of a species that terminates inconclusively, the more I must doubt the rationality of acting with purpose and singleness of mind, even though my life depends on it. And hence the more convinced I must be that I have fallen victim to an indefensible fanaticism. Consequently, it's not surprising that the more exhausting my effort to survive, the more ruthlessly I must suppress my awareness of the nature of the universe and of my affiliation with the human species. Nor, moreover, that the more successful my survival, the more nagging my suspicion that having disciplined myself to forget both where I am, namely in infinite space, and what I am doing there, namely trying to act human, my success is tinged with self-delusion, and my life shadowed by absurdity. If, however, having realized the falseness of my position, I am able to convince someone to work twice as hard as I in order that we both may survive, don't I maneuver that person into acting twice as absurdly as I, since that person must wear him or herself out, behaving with compulsive purposefulness, whereas I need be purposeful only with regard to supervising the person and keeping him or her on task? for I am otherwise as free of purpose as the wind. Industry, then, that is, the habitual application of purposeful behavior, while essential to survival, undermines human relations by defeating the purpose of civilized life, which, I daily become more convinced, is to automate survival so that as much as possible everyone can live without purpose, and thus be at one with themselves, with each other, and with the universe. That's why the major investors in mankind are never more irascible and ruthless than when, in their attempt to relieve themselves of purpose by shifting it onto others, the others balk at the imposition, with the result that the investors are placed in the awkward position of acting more and more to the purpose of imposing purpose on others, and of having less and less time to devote themselves to living in a free-spirited, purposeless manner. And truly, living without purpose is fast becoming a lost art, which can only mean that we humans are rapidly losing touch with the reason why we exist, namely, for no reason at all. Therefore, in order to rectify the situation, I propose we undertake a critique of nationalism. For in my opinion, the idea of preserving the nation at all costs is a major factor in keeping us enthralled to purposeful activity, since governments routinely kill us if we openly doubt their purpose.